The dispute centered on the Trump administration's attempt to deploy federally controlled National Guard troops from Illinois and Texas within the Chicago area, specifically to protect federal property and personnel, notably at an Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) facility in Broadview. This action was taken over the strenuous objections of state and local officials, including Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker and Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson, who filed a lawsuit challenging the deployment. A federal district court judge initially granted a temporary restraining order, blocking the troops from being operationally deployed to protect federal property or patrol, while the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals later allowed the troops to remain in Illinois under federal control, Title X status. Pending further arguments, the critical lower court ruling restricting their deployment remained a significant check on executive authority. The judge found insufficient credible evidence to justify the military intervention under the legal standard of suppressing a rebellion. Analysis. Reasons for the judicial block. The court's decision was rooted in two major legal pillars: the Insurrection Act threshold and the principle of federalism, specifically the 10th Amendment. The high bar of rebellion, the primary legal basis for the president to federalize and deploy the National Guard without a governor's consent, is Title 10 U.S.C. 12406, which is linked to the Insurrection Act. This authority is triggered by conditions such as foreign invasion, the inability to execute laws using ordinary means, or the presence of a rebellion or danger of a rebellion against federal authority. U.S. District Judge April Perry argued that the administration failed to meet this traditionally high threshold. The judge explicitly stated, "There has been no showing that the civil power has failed," noting that courts were functioning, arrests were being made, and local law enforcement was capable of handling protests. Furthermore, the court questioned the credibility of the Department of Homeland Security's DHS threat assessments, calling them unreliable, and noting that the definition of rebellion historically refers to organized, armed, and sustained resistance on a scale far beyond isolated acts of vandalism or civil disobedience. The court suggested that using military force was not called for when judicial and civilian processes remained operational. Federalism and state sovereignty. The ruling affirmed the constitutional tradition of keeping federal military involvement out of domestic civilian law enforcement. The lawsuit, filed by Illinois, argued that the deployment violated the state's 10th Amendment rights, which reserve powers not delegated to the federal government to the states. By unilaterally deploying military forces against the expressed will of the state's governor, the administration was perceived as threatening the balance of power critical to the U.S. federal system. Consequences and broader implications. The temporary block carries immediate and long-term consequences for intergovernmental relations and executive power. 1. Reinforcement of judicial review. This decision reaffirmed that a president's invocation of statutes like Title X is not completely insulated from judicial review. It established that courts have the authority to scrutinize whether the factual prerequisites for military deployment, like an actual rebellion, have been credibly met, preventing a president from invoking military force domestically purely on political grounds. 2. Federal-state friction. The deployment heightened tensions and political polarization between the federal government and Democratic-led states. State officials hailed the decision as a victory for state sovereignty, asserting that the administration was waging a war on cities rather than addressing legitimate threats. 3. Ambiguity of troops' status. The subsequent appellate court decision allowing the federalized troops to remain in the state but barring their deployment created an anomalous situation. Hundreds of military personnel remained stationary under federal command, Title X, but unable to execute the mission they were summoned for. This costly and legally ambiguous status highlighted the procedural mess created by the non-consensual deployment. Prediction and solutions. Prediction. The immediate legal future involves the appeal process continuing through the Seventh Circuit, likely focusing on whether courts should defer entirely to the president's judgment in defining a danger of rebellion versus the judiciary's ability to assess the factual evidence. Given the Ninth Circuit's previous approach in a similar case in California, which was highly deferential to the president but still affirmed judicial review, the ultimate decision will likely narrow the scope of the president's domestic military authority under Title X, requiring a more concrete showing of necessity than mere protest disruption. The high historical bar for an insurrection remains a powerful legal counterargument. Solutions for policy clarity. The underlying problem is the dangerously vague language of the Insurrection Act and related Title X authorities, which has not been meaningfully updated in over 150 years. 4. Congressional clarification. Congress must clearly define key terms like insurrection, rebellion, and domestic violence within Title X. Clearer statutory language would limit presidential discretion and provide a manageable, objective standard for judicial review. 5. Mandatory consultation. Legislation should mandate meaningful consultation or cooperation with state governors before a president federalizes National Guard units or deploys active duty forces for domestic law enforcement purposes, except in the most extreme, verified emergencies. 6. Operational separation. Future legislation should strictly separate military missions, like protecting federal buildings, from civilian law enforcement duties, like arrest and detainment. Ensuring the Posse Comitatus Act's spirit of preventing a military police force on American soil is maintained.